Section 15 of The Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2, by Anonymous. The History of Abul Hassan Ali ibn Ekar and Shemselnihar, favourite of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, Part 3. Letter from Shemselnihar to the Prince of Persia. The person who will deliver to you this letter will give you more correct information concerning me than I can, for I have not been myself since I saw you. Deprived of your presence, I endeavour to deceive myself by conversing with you by these ill-written lines, with the same pleasure as if I had the happiness of speaking to you in person. It is said that patience is a cure for all evils, but instead of relieving, it heightens my sufferings. Although your picture is deeply engraven in my heart, my eyes desire to have the original continually before them, and they will lose all their light if they be any considerable time deprived of this felicity. May I flatter myself that yours have the same impatience to see me? Yes, I can. Their tender glances have sufficiently assured me of this. How happy, Prince, would it be for you, how happy for Shemselnihar, if our united desires were not thwarted by invincible obstacles, obstacles which afflict me the more sensibly as they affect you. These thoughts which my fingers write, and which I express with incredible pleasure, repeating them again and again, proceed from the bottom of my heart, and from the incurable wound which you have made in it, a wound which I bless 1,000 times, notwithstanding the cruel torments I endure through your absence. I would reckon all that opposes our love nothing, were I only allowed to see you sometimes with freedom. I should then enjoy your company, and what could I desire more? Do not imagine that I say more than I think. Alas, whatever expressions I use, I feel that I think more than I can tell you. My eyes, which are continually watching and weeping for your return, my afflicted heart, which desires you alone, the sighs that escape me as often as I think on you, and that is every moment, my imagination, which represents no other object to me than my dear Prince, the complaints that I make to heaven for the rigour of my destiny, in a word, my grief, my distress, my torments, which have allowed me no ease since I was deprived of your presence, will vouch for what I write. Am not I unhappy to be born to love, without hope of enjoying the object of my passion? This afflicting thought oppresses me so that I should die, were I not persuaded that you love me. But this sweet comfort balances my despair, and preserves my life. Tell me that you love me always. I will keep your letter carefully, and read it 1,000 times a day. I shall endure my afflictions with less impatience. I pray heaven may cease to be angry at us, and grant us an opportunity to say that we love one another without fear, and that we shall never cease thus to love. Adieu. I salute Ebn Thayer, to whom we are so much obliged. The Prince of Persia was not satisfied with reading the letter once. He thought he had perused it with too little attention, and therefore read it again with more leisure, and while so doing, sometimes heaved deep sighs, sometimes shed tears, and sometimes broke out into transports of joy and tenderness as the contents affected him. In short, he could not keep his eyes off those characters drawn by so beloved a hand, and was beginning to read it a third time, when Ebn Thayer observed to him that the confidant had no time to lose, and that he ought to think of giving an answer. "Alas!" cried the Prince, How would you have me reply to so kind a letter? In what terms shall I express myself in my present disturbed state? My mind is tossed with 1,000 tormenting thoughts, which are lost the moment they are conceived to make way for others. So long as my body is influenced by the impressions of my mind, how shall I be able to hold the paper or guide a reed to write?" So saying, he took out of a little desk which was near him paper, a cane ready cut, and an inkhorn. The Prince of Persia, before he began to write, gave Shemselnihar's letter to Ebn Thayer, and prayed him to hold it open while he wrote, that by casting his eyes upon it he might the better see what to answer. He began to write, but the tears that fell from his eyes upon the paper obliged him several times to stop, that they might fall the more freely. At last he finished his letter, and giving it to Ebn Thayer, "Read it, I pray," said he, "and do me the favour to see if the disorder of my mind has allowed me to give a favourable answer." Ebn Thayer took it, and read as follows: The Prince of Persia's answer to Shemselnihar's letter. I was plunged in the deepest grief when I received your letter, but at the sight of it I was transported with unspeakable joy. When I beheld the characters written by your fair hand, my eyes were enlightened by a stronger light than they lost when yours were suddenly closed at the feet of my rival. The words contained in your kind epistle are so many rays which have dispelled the darkness wherewith my soul was obscured. They show me how much you suffer from your love of me, and that you are not ignorant of what I endure on your account. Thus they comfort me in my afflictions. On the one hand, they cause me to shed tears in abundance, and on the other inflame my heart with a fire which supports it and prevents my dying of grief. I have not had one moment's rest since our cruel separation. Your letter alone gave me some ease. I kept a mournful silence till the moment I received it, and then recovered my speech. I was buried in profound melancholy, but it inspired me with joy, which immediately appeared in my eyes and countenance. But my surprise at receiving a favour which I had not yet deserved was so great that I knew not how to begin to testify my thankfulness. In a word, after having kissed it several times as a precious pledge of your goodness, I read it over and over, and was confounded at the excess of my good fortune. You would have me declare that I always love you. Ah, did I not love you so perfectly as I do, I could not forbear adoring you after all the marks you have given me of an affection so uncommon. Yes, I love you, my dear soul, and shall account it my glory to burn all my days with that sweet fire you have kindled in my heart. I will never complain of that ardour with which I feel it consumes me, and how rigorous soever the evils I suffer, I will bear them with fortitude, in hopes some time or other to see you. Would to heaven it were to-day, and that instead of sending you my letter, I might be allowed to come and assure you in person that I die for you. My tears hinder me from saying more. Adieu." Ebn Thayer could not read these last lines without weeping. He returned the letter to the Prince of Persia, and assured him it wanted no correction. The Prince closed it, and when he had sealed it, he desired the trusty slave to come near, and said to her, "This is my answer to your dear mistress's letter. I conjure you to carry it to her, and to salute her in my name." The slave took the letter, and retired with Ebn Thayer. After Ebn Thayer had walked some way with the slave, he left her and went to his house, and began to think in earnest upon the amorous intrigue in which he found himself unhappily engaged. He considered that the Prince of Persia and Shemselnihar, notwithstanding their interest to conceal their correspondence, conducted themselves with so little discretion that it could not be long a secret. He drew all the consequences from it which a man of good sense might have anticipated. "Were Shemselnihar," said he to himself, "a lady of common rank, I would contribute all in my power to make her and her lover happy. But she is the Caliph's favourite, and no man can without danger attempt to engage the affections of the objects of his choice. His anger would fall in the first instance on Shemselnihar. It will next cost the Prince of Persia his life, and I should be involved in his misfortune. In the meantime I have my honour, my quiet, my family, and my property to preserve. I must, while I can, extricate myself out of such a perilous situation." These thoughts occupied his mind all that day. Next morning he went to the Prince of Persia with a design of making one more effort to induce him to conquer his passion. He represented to him what he had before urged in vain, that it would be much better for him to summon all his resolution to overcome his inclination for Shemselnihar than to suffer himself to be hurried away by it, and that his passion was so much the more dangerous as his rival was powerful. "In short, sir," added he, "if you will hearken to me, you ought to think of nothing but to triumph over your love. Otherwise you run the risk of destroying yourself with Shemselnihar, whose life ought to be dearer to you than your own. I give you this advice as a friend, for which you will some time or other thank me." The Prince heard Ebn Thayer with great impatience, but suffered him to speak his mind, and then replied to him thus: "Ebn Thayer, do you think I can cease to love Shemselnihar, who loves me so tenderly? She is not afraid to expose her life for me, and would you have me regard mine? No, whatever misfortunes befall me, I will love Shemselnihar to my last breath." Ebn Thayer, shocked at the obstinacy of the Prince of Persia, left him hastily, and going to his own house, recalled his former reflections, and began to think seriously what he should do. In the meantime a jeweller, one of his intimate friends, came to see him. The jeweller had perceived that Shemselnihar's confidant came oftener to Ebn Thayer than usual, and that he was constantly with the Prince of Persia, whose sickness was known to everyone, though not the cause. This had awakened the jeweller's suspicions, and finding Ebn Thayer very pensive, he presently judged that he was perplexed with some important affair, and fancying that he knew the cause, he asked what Shemselnihar's confidant wanted with him. Ebn Thayer, being struck with this question, would have dissembled, and told him that it was on some trifling errand she came so frequently to him. "You do not tell me the truth," said the jeweller, "and your dissimulation only serves to prove to me that this trifle is a more important affair than at first I thought it to be." Ebn Thayer, perceiving that his friend pressed him so much, said to him, "It is true that it is an affair of the greatest consequence. I had resolved to keep it secret, but since I know how much you are my friend, I choose rather to make you my confidant than to suffer you to be under a mistake about it. I do not bind you to secrecy, for you will easily judge by what I am going to tell you how impossible it is to keep it unknown." After this preamble, he told him the amour between Shemselnihar and the Prince of Persia. "You know," he continued, "in what esteem I am at court, in the city, and with lords and ladies of the greatest quality. What a disgrace would it be for me should this rash amour come to be discovered! But what do I say? Should not I and my family be completely ruined? That is what perplexes my mind, but I have just formed my resolution. I will go immediately and satisfy my creditors and recover my debts, and when I have secured my property, will retire to Bussorah, and stay till the storm that I foresee is blown over. My friendship for Shemselnihar and the Prince of Persia makes me very sensible to what dangers they are exposed. I pray heaven to convince them of their peril and to preserve them. But if their evil destiny should bring their attachment to the knowledge of the Caliph, I shall at least be out of the reach of his resentment. For I do not think them so wicked as to design to involve me in their misfortunes. It would be the height of ingratitude, and a bad reward for the service I have done them and the good advice I have given, particularly to the Prince of Persia, who may save both himself and his mistress from this precipice. He may as easily leave Baghdad as I, and absence will insensibly disengage him from a passion which will only increase whilst he continues in this place." The jeweller was extremely surprised at what Ebn Thayer told him. "What you say," said he, "is of so much importance that I cannot understand how Shemselnihar and the prince could have abandoned themselves to such a violent passion. What inclination soever they may have for one another, instead of yielding to it, they ought to resist it, and make a better use of their reason. Is it possible they can be insensible of the danger of their correspondence? How deplorable is their blindness! I anticipate all its consequences as well as yourself. But you are wise and prudent, and I approve your resolution, as it is the only way to deliver yourself from the fatal events which you have reason to fear." After this conversation, the jeweller rose and took his leave of Ebn Thayer. Before the jeweller retired, Ebn Thayer conjured him by the friendship betwixt them to say nothing of what he had heard. "Fear not," replied the jeweller, "I will keep this secret at the peril of my life." 2 days after, the jeweller went to Ebn Thayer's shop, and seeing it shut, he doubted not but he had executed his design. But to be more sure, he asked a neighbour if he knew why it was not opened. The neighbour answered that he knew not, unless Ebn Thayer was gone a journey. There was no need of his enquiring farther, and he immediately thought of the Prince of Persia. "Unhappy Prince," said he to himself, "what will be your grief when you hear this news? How will you now carry on your correspondence with Shemselnihar? I fear you will die of despair. I pity you, and must repair your loss of a too timid confidant." The business that obliged him to come abroad was of no consequence, so that he neglected it, and though he had no knowledge of the Prince of Persia, only by having sold him some jewels, he went to his house. He addressed himself to one of his servants, and desired him to tell his master that he wished to speak with him about business of very great importance. The servant returned immediately to the jeweller, and introduced him to the prince's chamber. He was leaning on a sofa, with his head on a cushion. As soon as the prince saw him, he rose up to receive and welcome him, and entreated him to sit down, asked him if he could serve him in anything, or if he came to tell him anything interesting concerning himself. "Prince," answered the jeweller, "though I have not the honour to be particularly acquainted with you, yet the desire of testifying my zeal has made me take the liberty to come to your house to impart to you a piece of news that concerns you. I hope you will pardon my boldness for my good intention." End of section 15, part 3. Section 16 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2, by Anonymous. The History of Abul Hassan Ali ibn Ekar and Shemselnihar, favourite of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, Part 4. After this introduction, the jeweller entered upon the matter and continued, "Prince, I shall have the honour to tell you that it is a long time since conformity of disposition and some business we have had together united Ebn Thayer and myself in strict friendship. I know you are acquainted with him, and that he has employed himself in obliging you to his utmost. I have learnt this from himself, for he keeps nothing secret from me, nor I from him. I went just now to his shop, and was surprised to find it shut. I addressed myself to one of his neighbours to ask the reason. He answered me that 2 days ago Ebn Thayer took leave of him and other neighbours, offering them his service at Bussorah, whither he is gone, said he, about an affair of great importance. Not being satisfied with this answer, my concern for his welfare determined me to come and ask if you knew anything particular concerning this, his sudden departure." At this discourse, which the jeweller accommodated to the subject, the better to compass his design, the Prince of Persia changed colour, and looked at the jeweller in a manner which convinced him how much he was disconcerted at the intelligence. "I am surprised at what you inform me," said he. "A greater misfortune could not befall me. Ah," he continued, with tears in his eyes, "if what you tell me be true, I am undone. Has Ebn Thayer, who was all my comfort, in whom I put all my confidence, left me? I cannot think of living after so cruel a blow." The jeweller needed no more to convince him fully of the Prince of Persia's violent passion, which Ebn Thayer had told him of. Mere friendship would not make him speak so. Nothing but love could produce such lively sensations. The prince continued some moments absorbed in melancholy thoughts. At last he lifted up his head, and calling one of his servants, said, "Go to Ebn Thayer's house, and ask some of his domestics if he be gone to Bussorah. Run, and come back quickly with the answer." While the servant was gone, the jeweller endeavoured to entertain the Prince of Persia with indifferent subjects, but the prince gave little heed to him. He was a prey to fatal grief. Sometimes he could not persuade himself that Ebn Thayer was gone, and at others he did not doubt of it, when he reflected upon the conversation he had had with him the last time he had seen him, and the abrupt manner in which he had left him. At last the prince's servant returned, and reported that he had spoken with one of Ebn Thayer's servants, who assured him that he had been gone 2 days to Bussorah. "As I came from Ebn Thayer's house," added the servant, "a slave well dressed met me, and after she had asked me if I had the honour to belong to you, told me she wanted to speak with you, and begged at the same time that she might accompany me. She is in the outer room, and I believe has a letter to deliver to you from some person of consequence." The prince commanded her to be immediately introduced, not doubting but it was Shemselnihar's confidant slave, as indeed it was. The jeweller knew her, having seen her several times at Ebn Thayer's house. She could not have come at a better time to save the prince from despair. She saluted him. The Prince of Persia returned the salute of Shemselnihar's confidant. The jeweller arose as soon as he saw her and retired, to leave them at liberty to converse together. The confidant, after she had spoken some time with the prince, took her leave and departed. She left him quite another person from what he was before. His eyes appeared brighter and his countenance more gay, which satisfied the jeweller that the good slave came to tell him something favourable to his amour. The jeweller, having taken his place again near the prince, said to him, smiling, "I see, Prince, you have business of importance at the Caliph's palace." The Prince of Persia, astonished and alarmed at these words, answered the jeweller, "What leads you to suppose that I have business at the Caliph's palace?" "I judge so," replied the jeweller, "by the slave who has just left you." "And to whom, think you, belongs this slave?" demanded the prince. "To Shemselnihar, the Caliph's favourite," answered the jeweller. "I know," continued he, "both the slave and her mistress, who has several times done me the honour to come to my house and buy jewels. Besides, I know that Shemselnihar keeps nothing secret from this slave, and I have seen her pass backwards and forwards for several days along the streets, as I thought, very much troubled. I imagined that it was for some affair of consequence concerning her mistress." The jeweller's words greatly troubled the Prince of Persia. "He would not say so," said he to himself, "if he did not suspect, or rather were not acquainted with my secret." He remained silent for some time, not knowing what course to take. At last he began, and said to the jeweller, "You have told me things which make me believe that you know yet more than you have acquainted me with. It concerns my repose that I be perfectly informed. I conjure you, therefore, not to conceal anything from me." Then the jeweller, who desired nothing more, gave him a particular account of what had passed betwixt Ebn Thayer and himself. He informed him that he was apprised of his correspondence with Shemselnihar, and forgot not to tell him that Ebn Thayer, alarmed at the danger of being his confidant in the matter, had communicated to him his intention of retiring to Bussorah until the storm which he dreaded should be blown over. "This he has executed," added the jeweller, "and I am surprised how he could determine to abandon you in the condition he informed me you were in. As for me, Prince, I confess I am moved with compassion towards you, and am come to offer you my service. If you do me the favour to accept of it, I engage myself to be as faithful to you as Ebn Thayer. Besides, I promise to be more resolute. I am ready to sacrifice my honour and life for you, and that you may not doubt of my sincerity, I swear by all that is sacred in our religion to keep your secret inviolable. Be persuaded then, Prince, that you will find in me the friend whom you have lost." This declaration encouraged the prince and comforted him under Ebn Thayer's absence. "I am glad," said he to the jeweller, "to find in you a reparation of my loss. I want words to express the obligations I am under to you. I pray God to recompense your generosity, and I accept your obliging offer with all my heart. Believe me," continued he, "Shemselnihar's confidant came to speak to me concerning you. She told me that it was you who advised Ebn Thayer to go from Baghdad. These were the last words she spoke to me as she went away, and she seemed persuaded of what she said. But they do not do you justice. I doubt not, after what you have told me, she is deceived." "Prince," replied the jeweller, "I have had the honour to give you a faithful account of my conversation with Ebn Thayer. It is true, when he told me he meant to retire to Bussorah, I did not oppose his design, but let not this prevent your putting confidence in me. I am ready to serve you with all imaginable zeal. If you do not use my service, this shall not hinder me from keeping your secret religiously, according to my oath." "I have already told you," replied the prince, "that I did not believe what the confidant said. It is her zeal which inspired her with this groundless suspicion, and you ought to excuse it, as I do." They continued their conversation for some time, and consulted together about the most convenient means to keep up the prince's correspondence with Shemselnihar. They agreed to begin by undeceiving the confidant, who was so unjustly prepossessed against the jeweller. The prince engaged to remove her mistake the first time he saw her again, and to entreat her to address herself to the jeweller whenever she might bring letters or any other information from her mistress to him. In short, they determined that she ought not to come so frequently to the prince's house, because thereby she might lead to the discovery of what it was of so great importance to conceal. At last the jeweller arose, and after having again entreated the Prince of Persia to place an unreserved confidence in him, withdrew. The jeweller, returning to his house, perceived before him a letter which somebody had dropped in the street. He took it up, and as it was not sealed, he opened it, and read as follows: Letter from Shemselnihar to the Prince of Persia. I have received from my confidant intelligence which gives me no less concern than it must give you. In Ebn Thayer we have indeed sustained a great loss, but let this not hinder you, dear Prince, from thinking of your own preservation. If our friend has abandoned us through fear, let us consider that it is a misfortune which we could not avoid. I confess Ebn Thayer has left us at a time when we most needed his assistance, but let us bear this unexpected stroke with patience, and let us not forbear to love one another constantly. Fortify your heart under this misfortune. The object of our wishes is not to be obtained without trouble. Let us not be discouraged, but hope that heaven will favour us, and that after so many afflictions we shall see a happy accomplishment of our desires. Adieu. While the jeweller was conversing with the Prince of Persia, the confidant had time to return to the palace and communicate to her mistress the ill news of Ebn Thayer's departure. Shemselnihar immediately wrote this letter and sent back her confidant with it to the Prince of Persia, but she negligently dropped it on her way. The jeweller was glad to find it, for it furnished him with an opportunity of justifying himself to the confidant and bringing her to the point he desired. When he had read it, he perceived the slave seeking for it with the greatest anxiety. He closed it again quickly and put it into his bosom, but the slave observed him, and running to him said, "Sir, I have dropped a letter which you had just now in your hand. I beseech you to restore it." The jeweller, pretending not to hear her, continued his way till he came to his house. He left his door open, that the confidant, who followed him, might enter after him. She followed him in, and when she came to his apartment, said, "Sir, you can make no use of that letter you have found, and you would not hesitate to return it to me if you knew from whom it came, and to whom it is directed. Besides, allow me to tell you, you cannot honestly keep it." Before the jeweller returned her any answer, he made her sit down, and then said to her, "Is not this letter from Shemselnihar, and is it not directed to the Prince of Persia?" The slave, who expected no such question, blushed. "The question embarrasses you," continued he, "but I assure you I do not put it rashly. I could have given you the letter in the street, but I wished you to follow me on purpose that I might come to some explanation with you. Is it just, tell me, to impute a misfortune to persons who have no ways contributed towards it? Yet this you have done, in telling the Prince of Persia that it was I who advised Ebn Thayer to leave Baghdad for his own safety. I do not intend to waste time in justifying myself. It is enough that the Prince of Persia is fully persuaded of my innocence. I will only tell you that, instead of contributing to Ebn Thayer's departure, I have been extremely afflicted at it, not so much from my friendship to him, as out of compassion for the condition in which he left the Prince of Persia, whose correspondence with Shemselnihar he has discovered to me. As soon as I knew certainly that Ebn Thayer was gone from Baghdad, I went and presented myself to the Prince, in whose house you found me, to inform him of this event, and to offer to undertake the service in which he had been employed. And provided you put the same confidence in me that you did in Ebn Thayer, it will be your own fault if you do not make my assistance of use to you. Inform your mistress of what I have told you, and assure her that though I should die for engaging in so dangerous an intrigue, I should not repent of having sacrificed myself for two lovers so worthy of one another." The confidant, after having heard the jeweller with great satisfaction, begged him to pardon the ill opinion she had conceived of him, for the zeal she had for her mistress's interest. "I am beyond measure glad," she added, "that Shemselnihar and the prince have found in you a person so fit to supply Ebn Thayer's place. I will not fail to convince my mistress of the good will you bear her." After the confidant had testified to the jeweller her joy to see him so well disposed to serve Shemselnihar and the Prince of Persia, the jeweller took the letter out of his bosom and restored it to her, saying, "Go, carry it quickly to the prince, and return this way, that I may see his reply. Forget not to give him an account of our conversation." The confidant took the letter and carried it to the prince, who answered it immediately. She returned to the jeweller's house to show him the answer, which was in these words: The Prince of Persia's answer to Shemselnihar. "Your precious letter has had a great effect upon me, but not so great as I could have wished. You endeavour to comfort me for the loss of Ebn Thayer. Alas, however sensible I am of this, it is but the least of my troubles. You know these troubles, and you know also that your presence alone can cure me. When will the time come that I shall enjoy it without fear of a separation? How distant does it seem to me? Or shall we flatter ourselves that we may ever see it? You command me to preserve myself. I will obey you, since I have renounced my own will to follow only yours. Adieu." After the jeweller had read this letter, he returned it to the confidant, who said, as she was going away, "I will desire my mistress to put the same confidence in you that she did in Ebn Thayer. You shall hear of me tomorrow." Accordingly, next day she returned with a pleasant countenance. "Your very looks," said he to her, "inform me that you have brought Shemselnihar to the point you wished." "It is true," replied the confidant, "and you shall hear how I succeeded. I found yesterday on my return Shemselnihar expecting me with impatience. I gave her the Prince of Persia's letter, and she read it with tears in her eyes. When she had done, I saw that she had abandoned herself to her usual sorrow. 'Madam,' said I to her, 'it is doubtless Ebn Thayer's removal that troubles you, but suffer me to conjure you, in the name of God, to alarm yourself no farther on this account. We have found another Ebn Thayer, who offers to oblige you with equal zeal, and, what is yet more important, with greater courage.' Then I spoke to her of you," continued the slave, "and acquainted her with the motive which led you to the Prince of Persia's house. In short, I assured her that you would keep inviolably the secret betwixt her and the Prince of Persia, and that you were resolved to favour their amour with all your might." She seemed to be much relieved by my discourse. "Ah, what obligations," said she, "are the Prince of Persia and I under to that honest man you speak of! I must be acquainted with him and see him, that I may hear from his own mouth what you tell me, and thank him for such unheard of generosity towards persons on whose account he is no way obliged to interest himself. The sight of him will give me pleasure, and I shall omit nothing to confirm him in those good sentiments. Fail not to bring him to me tomorrow. Therefore, sir, be so good as to accompany me to the palace." The confidant's proposal perplexed the jeweller. "Your mistress," replied he, "must allow me to say that she has not duly considered what she requires of me. Ebn Thayer's access to the caliph gave him admission everywhere, and the officers who knew him allowed him free access to Shemselnihar's palace. But as for me, how dare I enter? You see clearly that it is impossible. I entreat you to represent to Shemselnihar the reasons which prevent me from affording her that satisfaction, and acquaint her with all the ill consequences that would attend my compliance. If she considered it ever so little, she would find that it would expose me needlessly to very imminent danger." The confidante endeavoured to encourage the jeweller. "Can you believe," said she, "that Shemselnihar is so unreasonable as to expose you to the least danger by bringing you to her, from whom she expects such important services? Consider with yourself that there is not the least appearance of risk. My mistress and I are too much interested in this affair to involve you in any danger. You may depend upon me, and leave yourself to my conduit. After the thing is over, you will be the first to confess that your apprehensions were groundless." The jeweller yielded to the confidante's assurances, and rose up to follow her. But notwithstanding his boasted courage, he was seized with such terror that his whole body trembled. "In your present state," said she, "I perceive it will be better for you to remain at home, and that Shemselnihar should take other measures to see you. It is not to be doubted but that to satisfy her desire she will come hither herself. The case being so, sir, I would not have you go. I am persuaded it will not be long ere you see her here." The confidante foresaw this, for she no sooner informed Shemselnihar of the jeweller's fear, but she prepared to go to his house. He received her with all the expressions of profound respect. When she sat down, being a little fatigued, she unveiled herself and exhibited to the jeweller such beauty as convinced him that the Prince of Persia was excusable in giving his heart to the caliph's favourite. Then she saluted the jeweller with a graceful air, and said to him, "I could not hear with what zeal you have engaged in the Prince of Persia's concerns and mine, without immediately determining to express my gratitude in person. I thank Heaven for having so soon made up to us the loss of Ebn Thayer." Shemselnihar said many other obliging things to the jeweller, after which she returned to her palace. The jeweller went immediately to give an account of this visit to the Prince of Persia, who said to him as soon as he saw him, "I have expected you impatiently. The trusty slave has brought me a letter from her mistress, but it does not relieve me. Whatever the lovely Shemselnihar says, I dare not hope, and my patience is exhausted. I know not now what measures to pursue. Ebn Thayer's departure reduces me to despair. He was my only support. In him I have lost everything. I had flattered myself with some hopes by reason of his access to Shemselnihar." After these words, which the prince spoke with so much eagerness that he gave the jeweller no time to interrupt him, he said to the prince, "No man can take more interest in your affliction than I do, and if you will have patience to hear me, you will perceive that I can relieve you." Upon this the prince became silent and listened to him. "I see," said the jeweller, "that the only way to give you satisfaction is to devise a plan that will afford you an opportunity of conversing freely with Shemselnihar. This I wish to procure you, and tomorrow will make the attempt. You must by no means expose yourself to enter Shemselnihar's palace. You know by experience the danger of that step. I know a fitter place for this interview, where you will be safe." When the jeweller had finished, the prince embraced him with transports of joy. "You revive," said he, "by this promise, a wretched lover who was condemned to die. You have fully repaired the loss of Ebn Thayer. Whatever you do will be well performed. I leave myself entirely to your conduct." End of section 16, part 4. Section 17 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2, by Anonymous. The History of Abul Hassan Ali ibn Ikar and Shemselnihar, favourite of Caliph Harun al-Rashid. Part 5. After the prince had thus thanked him for his zeal, the jeweller returned home, and next morning Shemselnihar's confidant came to him. He told her that he had given the Prince of Persia hopes that he should shortly see her mistress. "I am come on purpose," answered she, "to concert measures with you for that end. I think this house will be convenient enough for their interview." "I could receive them very well here," replied he, "but I think they will have more liberty in another house of mine, where no one resides at present. I will immediately furnish it for their reception." "There remains nothing then for me to do," replied the confidant, "but to bring Shemselnihar to consent to this. I will go and speak to her, and return speedily with an answer." She was as diligent as her promise, and returning to the jeweller, told him that her mistress would not fail to keep the appointment in the evening. In the meantime she gave him a purse, and told him it was to prepare a collation. He carried her immediately to the house where the lovers were to meet, that she might know whither to bring her mistress, and when she was gone, he went to borrow from his friends gold and silver plate, tapestry, rich cushions, and other furniture, with which he furnished the house very magnificently, and when he had put all things in order, went to the Prince of Persia. You may easily conceive the Prince of Persia's joy when the jeweller told him that he came to conduct him to the house he had prepared to receive him and Shemselnihar. This news made him forget all his former trouble. He put on a magnificent robe, and went without his retinue along with the jeweller, who led him through several by-streets that nobody might observe them, and at last brought him to the house, where they conversed together until Shemselnihar's arrival. They did not wait long for this passionate lover. She came after evening prayer with her confidant and 2 other slaves. It is impossible to express the excessive joy that seized these 2 lovers when they saw one another. They sat down together upon a sofa, looking upon one another for some time without being able to speak, they were so much overjoyed. But when their speech returned, they soon made up for their silence. They said to each other so many tender things as made the jeweller, the confidant, and the 2 other slaves weep. The jeweller, however, restrained his tears to attend the collation, which he brought in himself. The lovers ate and drank little, after which they sat down again upon the sofa. Shemselnihar asked the jeweller if he had a lute or any other instrument. The jeweller, who took care to provide all that could please her, brought her a lute. She spent some time in tuning it, and then sung. While Shemselnihar was charming the Prince of Persia, and expressing her passion by words composed extempore, a great noise was heard, and immediately the slave, whom the jeweller had brought with him, came in great alarm to tell him that some people were breaking in at the gate. That he asked who they were, but instead of any answer the blows were redoubled. The jeweller, being alarmed, left Shemselnihar and the prince to inform himself of the truth of this intelligence. No sooner had he got to the court than he perceived, notwithstanding the darkness of the night, a company of men armed with spears and scimitars, who had broken the gate and came directly towards him. He stood close to a wall for fear of his life, and saw 10 of them pass without being perceived by them. Finding he could give no great assistance to the Prince of Persia and Shemselnihar, he contented himself with lamenting their fate, and fled for refuge to a neighbour's house, who was not yet gone to bed. He did not doubt but this unexpected violence was by the Caliph's order, who, he thought, had been informed of his favourite's meeting the Prince of Persia there. He heard a great noise in his house, which continued till midnight, and when all was quiet, as he thought, he desired his neighbour to lend him a scimitar, and being thus armed, went on till he came to the gate of his own house. He entered the court full of fear, and perceived a man, who asked him who he was. He knew by his voice that it was his own slave. "How did you manage," said he, "to avoid being taken by the watch?" "Sir," answered the slave, "I hid myself in a corner of the court, and I went out as soon as I heard the noise. But it was not the watch who broke into your house. They were robbers, who within these few days robbed another house in this neighbourhood. They doubtless had notice of the rich furniture you brought hither, and had that in view." The jeweller thought his slave's conjecture probable enough. He entered the house, and saw that the robbers had taken all the furniture out of the apartment where he received Shemselnihar and her lover, that they had also carried off the gold and silver plate, and, in a word, had left nothing. Perceiving this desolation, he exclaimed, "O heaven, I am irrecoverably ruined! What will my friends say? And what excuse can I make when I shall tell them that the robbers have broken into my house and robbed me of all they had generously lent me? I shall never be able to make up their loss. Besides, what is become of Shemselnihar and the Prince of Persia? This business will be so public that it will be impossible but it must reach the Caliph's ears. He will get notice of this meeting, and I shall fall a sacrifice to his fury." The slave, who was very much attached to him, endeavoured to comfort him. "As to Shemselnihar," said he, "the robbers would probably content themselves with stripping her, and you have reason to think that she is retired to her palace with her slaves. The Prince of Persia too has probably escaped, so that you have reason to hope the Caliph will never know of this adventure. As for the loss your friends have sustained, that is a misfortune that you could not avoid. They know very well the robbers are numerous, that they have not only pillaged the house I have already spoken of, but many other houses of the principal noblemen of the court, and they are not ignorant that, notwithstanding the orders given to apprehend them, nobody has been yet able to seize any of them. You will be acquitted by restoring your friends the value of the things that are stolen, and, blessed be God, you will have enough left." While they were waiting for daylight, the jeweller ordered the slave to mend the street door, which was broken, as well as he could, after which he returned to his usual residence with his slave, making melancholy reflections on what had happened. "Ebn Thayer," said he to himself, "has been wiser than I. He foresaw the misfortune into which I have blindly thrown myself. Would to God I had never meddled in this intrigue, which will perhaps cost me my life." It was scarcely day when the report of the robbery spread through the city, and a great many of his friends and neighbours came to his house to express their concern for his misfortune, but were curious to know the particulars. He thanked them for their affection, and had at least the consolation that he heard no one mention Shemselnihar or the Prince of Persia, which made him believe they were at their houses, or in some secure place. When the jeweller was alone, his servants brought him something to eat, but he had no appetite. About noon, one of his slaves came to tell him there was a man at the gate, whom he knew not, that desired to speak with him. The jeweller, not choosing to receive a stranger into his house, rose up and went to speak to him. "Though you do not know me," said the man, "I know you, and I am come to talk to you about an important affair." The jeweller desired him to come in. "No," answered the stranger. "If you please, rather take the trouble to go with me to your other house." "How know you," asked the jeweller, "that I have another house?" "I know very well," answered the stranger. "Follow me, and do not fear anything. "I have something to communicate which will please you." The jeweller went immediately with him, and after he had considered by the way how the house they were going to had been robbed, he said to him that it was not fit to receive him. When they were before the house, and the stranger saw the gate half broken down, he said to the jeweller, "I see you have told me the truth. I will conduct you to a place where we shall be better accommodated." When he had thus spoken, he went on, and walked all the rest of the day without stopping. The jeweller, being fatigued with his walk, vexed to see night approach, and that the stranger went on without telling him where he was going, began to lose his patience, when they came to a path which led to the Tigris. As soon as they reached the river, they embarked in a little boat, and went over. The stranger led the jeweller through a long street, where he had never been before, and after he had brought him through several by-streets, he stopped at a gate, which he opened. He made the jeweller go in before him. He then shut and bolted the gate with a huge iron bolt, and conducted him to a chamber where there were 10 other men, all of them as great strangers to the jeweller as he who had brought him hither. These 10 men received him without much ceremony. They desired him to sit down, of which he had great need, for he was not only out of breath with walking so far, but his terror at finding himself with people whom he thought he had reason to fear would have disabled him from standing. They waited for their leader to go to supper, and as soon as he came it was served up. They washed their hands, obliged the jeweller to do the like, and to sit at table with them. After supper the men asked him if he knew whom he spoke to. He answered, "No," and that he knew not the place he was in. "Tell us your last night's adventure," said they to him, "and conceal nothing from us." The jeweller, being astonished at this request, answered, "Gentlemen, it is probable you know it already." "That is true," replied they. "The young man and the young lady, who were at your house yesternight, told it us, but we would know it from your own mouth." The jeweller needed no more to inform him that he spoke to the robbers who had broken into and plundered his house. "Gentlemen," said he, "I am much troubled for that young man and lady. Can you give me any tidings of them?" Upon the jeweller's inquiry of the thieves, if they knew anything of the young man and the young lady, they answered, "Be not concerned for them, they are safe and well." So saying, they showed him 2 closets, where they assured him they were separately shut up. They added, "We are informed you alone know what relates to them, which we no sooner came to understand, but we showed them all imaginable respect, and were so far from doing them any injury that we treated them with all possible kindness on your account. We answer for the same," proceeded they, "for your own person. You may put unlimited confidence in us." The jeweller, being encouraged by this assurance, and overjoyed to hear that the Prince of Persia and Shemselnihar were safe, resolved to engage the robbers yet farther in their interest. He commended them, flattered them, and gave them 1,000 benedictions. "Gentlemen," said he, "I must confess I have not the honour to know you, yet it is no small happiness to me that I am not wholly unknown to you, and I can never be sufficiently grateful for the favours which that knowledge has procured me at your hands. Not to mention your great humanity, I am fully persuaded now that persons of your character are capable of keeping a secret faithfully, and none are so fit to undertake a great enterprise, which you can best bring to a good issue by your zeal, courage, and intrepidity. Confiding in these qualities, which are so much your due, I hesitate not to tell you my whole history, with that of those 2 persons you found in my house, with all the fidelity you desire me." After the jeweller had thus secured, as he thought, the confidence of the robbers, he made no scruple to relate to them the whole amour of the Prince of Persia and Shemselnihar, from the beginning of it to the time he had received them into his house. The robbers were greatly astonished at all the particulars they heard, and could not forbear exclaiming, "How! Is it possible that the young man should be the illustrious Ali Ebn Becar, Prince of Persia, and the young lady, the fair and celebrated beauty Shemselnihar?" The jeweller assured them nothing was more certain, and that they need not think it strange that persons of so distinguished a character should wish not to be known. Upon this assurance of their quality, the robbers went immediately, one after another, and threw themselves at their feet, imploring their pardon, and protesting that nothing of the kind would have happened to them had they been informed of the quality of their persons before they broke into the house, and that they would by their future conduct endeavour to make amends for the crime they had thus ignorantly committed. Then, turning to the jeweller, they told him they were heartily sorry they could not restore to him all that had been taken from him, part of it being no longer in their possession, but as for what remained, if he would content himself with his plate, it should be forthwith put into his hand. The jeweller was overjoyed at the favour done him, and after the robbers had delivered to him the plate, they required of the prince, Shemselnihar, and him, to promise them upon oath that they would not betray them, and they would carry them to a place whence they might easily return to their respective homes. The prince, Shemselnihar, and the jeweller replied that they might rely on their words, but since they desired an oath of them, they solemnly swore not to discover them. The thieves, satisfied with this, immediately went out with them. On the way, the jeweller, uneasy at not seeing the confidant and the two slaves, came up to Shemselnihar and begged her to inform him what was become of them. She answered she knew nothing of them, and that all she could tell him was that she was carried away from his house, ferried over the river, and brought to the place from whence they were just come. Shemselnihar and the jeweller had no farther conversation. They let the robbers conduit them with the prince to the river's side, when the robbers immediately took boat and carried them over to the opposite bank. While the prince, Shemselnihar, and the jeweller were landing, they heard the noise of the horse patrol coming towards them, just as the boat had conveyed the robbers back. The commander of the brigade demanded of the prince, Shemselnihar, and the jeweller who they were, and whence they had come so late. Frightened as they were, and apprehensive of saying anything that might prejudice them, they could not speak. But at length it was necessary they should. The jeweller's mind being most at ease, he said, "Sir, I can assure you we are respectable people of the city. The persons who have just landed us, and are now returned to the other side of the water, are thieves, who, having last night broke open the house where we were, pillaged it, and afterwards carried us to their quarters, whence, by fair words, we prevailed on them to let us have our liberty, and they brought us hither. They have restored us part of the booty they had taken from us." At which words he showed the parcel of plate he had recovered. The commander, not satisfied with what the jeweller had told him, came up to him and the Prince of Persia, and looking steadfastly at them, said, "Tell me truly, who is this lady? How came you to know her?" These questions embarrassed them so much that neither of them could answer, till at length Shemselnihar extricated them from their difficulty, and taking the commander aside, told him who she was. Which he no sooner heard than he alighted with expressions of great respect and politeness, and ordered his men to bring 2 boats. When the boats were come, he put Shemselnihar into one, and the Prince of Persia and the jeweller into the other, with 2 of his people in each boat, with orders to accompany each of them whithersoever they were bound. The boats took different routes, but we shall at present speak only of that which contained the prince and the jeweller. The prince, to save his guides trouble, bade them land the jeweller at his house, naming the place. The guide, by this direction, stopped just before the caliph's palace, which put both him and the jeweller into great alarm, for although they had heard the commander's orders to his men, they could not help imagining they were to be delivered up to the guard, to be brought before the caliph next morning. This, nevertheless, was not the intention of the guides, for after they had landed them, they, by their master's command, recommended them to an officer of the caliph's guard, who assigned them 2 soldiers to conduct them by land to the prince's house, which was at some distance from the river. They arrived there, but so tired and weary that they could hardly move. The prince being come home, with the fatigue of his journey, and this misadventure to himself and Shemselnihar, which deprived him of all hope of ever seeing her more, fell into a swoon on his sofa. While the greatest part of his servants were endeavouring to recover him, the rest gathered about the jeweller, and begged him to tell them what had happened to the prince their lord, whose absence had occasioned them such inexpressible uneasiness. While the greatest part of the prince's domestics were endeavouring to recover him from his swoon, others of them got about the jeweller, desiring to know what had happened to their lord. The jeweller, who took care to discover nothing that was not proper for them to know, told them that it was an extraordinary case, but that it was not a time to relate it, and that they would do better to go and assist the prince. By good fortune, the prince came to himself that moment, and those that but just before required his history with so much earnestness retreated to a respectful distance. End of Section 17, Part 5. Section 18 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2, by Anonymous. The History of Abul Hassan Ali ibn Ekar and Shemselnihar, favourite of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, Part 6. Although the prince had in some measure recovered his recollection, he continued so weak that he could not open his mouth to speak. He answered only by signs, even to his nearest relations, when they spoke to him. He remained in this condition till next morning, when the jeweller came to take leave of him. He could answer only by a movement of his eyes, and holding out his right hand. But when he saw he was laden with a bundle of plate, which the thieves had returned to him, he made a sign to his servants that they should take it and carry it to his house. The jeweller had been expected with great impatience by his family the day he departed with the stranger, but now he was quite given over, and it was no longer doubted but some disaster had befallen him. His wife, children, and servants were in the greatest alarm, and lamenting him. When he arrived, their joy was excessive, yet they were troubled to see that he was so much altered in the short interval that he was hardly to be known. This was occasioned by the great fatigue of the preceding day, and the fears he had undergone all night, which would not permit him to sleep. Finding himself much indisposed, he continued at home 2 days, and would admit only one of his intimate friends to visit him. The 3rd day, finding himself something better, he thought he might recover strength by going abroad to take the air, and therefore went to the shop of a rich merchant of his acquaintance, with whom he continued long in conversation. As he was rising to take leave of his friend to return home, he observed a woman making a sign to him, whom he presently knew to be the confidant of Shemselnihar. Between fear and joy, he made what haste he could away without looking at her, but she followed him, as he feared she would, the place they were in being by no means proper to converse in. As he quickened his pace, she, not being able to overtake him, every now and then called out to him to stay. He heard her, but after what had happened, he did not think fit to speak to her in public, for fear of giving cause to suspect that he was connected with Shemselnihar. It was known to everybody in Baghdad that this woman belonged to her, and executed all her little commissions. He continued the same pace, and at length reached a mosque, where he knew but few people came. He entered, and she followed him, and they had a long conversation together, without anybody overhearing them. Both the jeweller and confidant expressed much joy at seeing each other, after the strange adventure of the robbers, and their reciprocal apprehension for each other, without regarding their own particular persons. The jeweller wished her to relate to him how she escaped with the 2 slaves, and what she knew of Shemselnihar from the time he lost sight of her, but so great was her eagerness to know what had happened to him from the time of their unexpected separation, that he found himself obliged to satisfy her. "Having given you the detail you desired," said he, "oblige me in your turn," which she did in the following manner. "When I first saw the robbers, I hastily imagined that they were soldiers of the Caliph's guard, and that the Caliph, being informed of Shemselnihar's going out, had sent them to put her, the prince, and all of us to death. Under this impression, I immediately got up to the terrace of your house, when the thieves entered the apartment where the prince and Shemselnihar were, and I was soon after followed by that lady's 2 slaves. From terrace to terrace, we came at last to a house of very honest people, who received us with much civility, and with whom we lodged that night. Next morning, after thanking the master of the house for our good usage, we returned to Shemselnihar's palace, where we entered in great disorder and distress, because we could not learn the fate of the 2 unfortunate lovers. The other women of Shemselnihar were astonished to see me return without their lady. We told them we had left her at the house of one of her female friends, and that she would send for us when she wished to come home, with which excuse they seemed well satisfied. For my part, I spent the day in great uneasiness, and when night arrived, opening a small private gate, I espied a little boat on the canal, which seemed driven by the stream. I called to the waterman, and desired him to row up each side of the river, and look if he could not see a lady, and if he found her, to bring her along with him. The 2 slaves and I waited impatiently for his return, and at length about midnight we saw the boat coming down with 2 men in it, and a woman lying along in the stern. When the boat was come up, the 2 men helped the woman to rise, and then it was I knew her to be Shemselnihar. I cannot express my joy at seeing her. I gave my hand to Shemselnihar to help her out of the boat. She had great need of my assistance, for she could hardly stand. When she was landed, she whispered me in a tone expressive of her affliction, and bade me go and take a purse of 1,000 pieces of gold, and give it to the 2 soldiers that had accompanied her. I left her to the care of the 2 slaves to support her, and having ordered the 2 soldiers to wait for me a moment, I took the purse and returned instantly. I gave it to them, and having paid the waterman, shut the door. I then followed my lady, and overtook her before she had reached her chamber. We immediately undressed her and put her to bed, where she had not long been before she became so ill that for the whole of the night we almost despaired of her life. The day following, her other women expressed a great desire to see her, but I told them she had been greatly fatigued and wanted rest. The other 2 women and I gave her all the assistance in our power, but we should have given over every hope of her recovery had I not at last perceived that the wine which we every now and then gave her had a sensible effect in recruiting her strength. By importunity we at length prevailed with her to eat. When she recovered the use of her speech, for she had hitherto only wept, groaned, and sighed, I begged of her to tell me how she had escaped out of the hands of the robbers. "Why would you require of me," said she with a profound sigh, "to renew my grief? Would to God the robbers had taken away my life, rather than have preserved it. My misfortunes would then have had an end, whereas I live but to increase my sufferings." "Madam," I replied, "I beg you would not refuse me this favour. You cannot but know that the wretched feel a consolation in relating their greatest misfortunes. What I ask would alleviate yours, if you would have the goodness to gratify me." "Here then," said she, "the most afflicting adventure that could possibly have happened to one so deeply in love as myself, who considered myself as at the utmost point of my wishes. You must know, when I first saw the robbers enter, sword in hand, I considered it as the last moment of our lives. But death was not an object of regret, since I thought I was to die with the Prince of Persia. However, instead of murdering us, as I expected, 2 of the robbers were ordered to take care of us, whilst their companions were busied in packing up the goods they found in the house. When they had done, and got their bundles upon their backs, they went out, and took us with them. As we went along, one of those that had charge of us demanded of me who I was. I answered I was a dancer. He put the same question to the prince, who replied he was a citizen. When we had reached the place of our destination, a new alarm seized us. They gathered about us, and after having considered my dress and the rich jewels I was adorned with, they seemed to suspect I had disguised my quality. "Dancers," said they, "do not used to be dressed as you are. Tell us truly who you are." When they saw I made no reply, they asked the prince once more who he was, for they told him they plainly perceived he was not the person he pretended to be. He did not satisfy them much more than I had done. He only told them he came to see the jeweller, naming him, who was the owner of the house where they found us. "I know this jeweller," replied one of the rogues, who seemed to have some authority over the rest. "I owe him some obligations which he knows nothing of, and I take upon me to bring him hither tomorrow morning. But you must not expect," continued he, "to be released till he arrives and tells us who you are. In the meantime, I promise you there shall be no injury offered to you." The jeweller was brought next morning, who, thinking to oblige us, as he really did, declared to the robbers the whole truth. They immediately came and asked my pardon, and I believe did the like to the prince, who was shut up in another room. They protested to me they would not have broken open the house where we were, had they known it was the jeweller's. They soon after took us, the prince, the jeweller, and myself, carried us to the riverside, put us aboard a boat, and rowed us across the water. But we were no sooner landed than a party of horse patrol came up to us. The robbers fled. I took the commander aside and told him my name, and that the night before I had been seized by robbers, who forced me along with them, but having been told who I was, released me, and the 2 persons he saw with me, on my account. He alighted out of respect to me, and expressing great joy at being able to oblige me, caused 2 boats to be brought, putting me and 2 of his soldiers, whom you have seen, into one, he escorted me hither. But what is become of the prince and his friend, I cannot tell. I trust," added she, melting into tears, "no harm has befallen them since our separation, and I do not doubt but the prince's concern for me is equal to mine for him. The jeweller, to whom we have been so much obliged, ought to be recompensed for the loss he has sustained on our account. Fail not, therefore, to take 2 purses of 1,000 pieces of gold in each, and carry them to him tomorrow morning in my name, and be sure to inquire after the prince's welfare." When my good mistress had done speaking, I endeavoured, as to the last article of inquiring into the prince's welfare, to persuade her to endeavour to triumph over her passion, after the danger she had so lately escaped almost by miracle. "Make me no answer," said she, "but do what I require." I was obliged to be silent, and am come hither to obey her commands. I have been at your house, but not finding you at home, and uncertain as I was of where you might be found, was about going to the Prince of Persia. But not daring to attempt the journey, I have left the 2 purses with a particular friend, and if you will wait here, I will go and fetch them immediately." The confidant soon returned to the jeweller in the mosque where she had left him, and giving him the 2 purses, bade him out of them satisfy his friends. "They are much more than is necessary," said he, "but I dare not refuse the present from so good and generous a lady to her most humble servant. I beseech you to assure her from me that I shall preserve an eternal remembrance of her goodness." He then agreed with the confidant that she should find him at the house where she had first seen him, whenever she had occasion to impart anything from Shemselnihar, or to hear any tidings of the Prince of Persia. And so they parted. The jeweller returned home well pleased, not only that he had got wherewithal so fully to satisfy his friends, but also to think that no person in Baghdad could possibly know that the Prince and Shemselnihar had been in his other house when it was robbed. It is true he had acquainted the thieves with it, but on their secrecy he thought he might very well depend. Next morning he visited the friends who had obliged him, and found no difficulty in satisfying them. He had money in hand to furnish his other house, in which he placed servants. Thus he forgot all his past danger, and the next evening waited on the Prince of Persia. The prince's domestics told the jeweller that he came very opportunely, as the prince, since he had parted with him, was reduced to such a state that his life was in danger. They introduced him softly into his chamber, and he found him in a condition that excited his pity. He was lying on his bed with his eyes closed, but when the jeweller saluted him and exhorted him to take courage, he recollected him, opened his eyes, and gave him a look that sufficiently declared the greatness of his affliction, infinitely beyond what he felt after he first saw Shemselnihar. He grasped him by the hand to testify his friendship, and told him in a feeble voice that he was extremely obliged to him for coming so far to visit one so unhappy and wretched. "Prince," replied the jeweller, "mention not, I beseech you, any obligations you owe to me. I wish the good offices I have endeavoured to do you had had a better effect. But at present let us talk only of your health, which, in the state I see you, I fear you greatly injure by unreasonably abstaining from proper nourishment." The prince's servants took this opportunity to tell him it was with the greatest difficulty they had prevailed on their master to take the smallest refreshment, and that for some time he had taken nothing. This obliged the jeweller to entreat the prince to let his servants bring him something to eat. After the prince had, through the persuasion of the jeweller, eaten more than he had hitherto done, he commanded the servants to leave him alone with his friend. When the room was clear, he said, "Besides the misfortune that distracts me, I have been exceedingly concerned to think what a loss you have sustained on my account, and it is but just I should make you some recompense. But before I do this, after begging your pardon 1,000 times, I conjure you to tell me whether you have learnt any tidings of Shemselnihar, since I had the misfortune to be parted from her." Here the jeweller, instructed by the confidant, related to him all that he knew of Shemselnihar's arrival at her palace, her state of health from that time till she recovered, and how she had sent her confidant to him to inquire after his welfare. To all this the prince replied only by sighs and tears. He made an effort to get up, and calling his servants, went himself to his wardrobe, and having caused several bundles of rich furniture and plate to be packed up, he ordered them to be carried to the jeweller's house. The jeweller would fain have declined this kind offer, but although he represented that Shemselnihar had already made him more than sufficient amends for what he had lost, the prince would be obeyed. The jeweller was therefore obliged to make all possible acknowledgments, and protested how much he was confounded at his Highness's liberality. He would then have taken his leave, but the prince desired him to stay, and they passed good part of the night in conversation. Next morning the jeweller waited again on the prince, who made him sit down by him. "You know," said he, "there is an end proposed in all things. That which the lover proposes is to enjoy the beloved object in spite of all opposition. If once he loses that hope, he must not think to live. Such is my hard case, for twice when I have been at the very point of fulfilling my desires, I have suddenly been torn from her I loved in the most cruel manner imaginable. It remains for me only to think of death, and I had sought it but that our holy religion forbids suicide. But I need not anticipate it. I need not wait long." Here he stopped, and vented his passion in groans, sighs, sobs, and tears, which flowed abundantly. The jeweller, who knew no better way of diverting him from his despair than by bringing Shemselnihar into his mind and giving him some shadow of hope, told him he feared the confidant might be come from her lady, and therefore it would not be proper to stay any longer from home. "I will let you go," said the prince, "but conjure you that if you see her, you recommend to her to assure Shemselnihar that if I die, as I expect to do shortly, I shall love her to the last moment, even in the grave." The jeweller returned home, and waited in expectation of seeing the confidant, who came some hours after, but all in tears and in great affliction. The jeweller, alarmed, asked her what was the matter. She answered that Shemselnihar, the prince, herself, and he were all ruined. "Hear the sad news," said she, "as it was told me just upon my entering the palace after I had left you. Shemselnihar had for some fault chastised one of the slaves you saw with her when you met in your other house. The slave, enraged at the ill treatment, ran immediately away, and finding the gate open went out, so that we have just reason to believe she has discovered all to a eunuch of the guard who gave her protection. But this is not all. The other slave, her companion, has fled too, and has taken refuge in the caliph's palace, so that we may well fear she has borne her part in this discovery. For just as I came away, the caliph had sent 20 of his eunuchs for Shemselnihar, who have carried her to the palace. I just found means to come and tell you this. I know not what has passed, yet I fear no good. But above all, I recommend to you to keep the secret inviolate." The confidant added to what she had related before to the jeweller, that it was proper he should go immediately and acquaint the prince with the whole affair, that he might be prepared for every event, and keep faithful to the common cause. She went away in haste, without staying for any answer. End of section 18, part 6.
Section 19 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Catherine E. The Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2, by Anonymous. Translated by Dr. Jonathan Scott, 1754 through 1829. The History of Abul Hassan Ali ibn Nekar and Shemselnihar, favorite of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, Part 7. What answer could the jeweller have made in the condition he was in? He stood motionless as if thunderstruck. He found, however, that there was no time to be lost, and immediately went to give the prince information. He addressed him with an air that sufficiently showed the bad news he brought. "Prince," said he, "arm yourself with courage and patience, and prepare to receive the most terrible shock that ever you had to encounter." "Tell me in a few words," replied the prince, "what is the matter, without keeping me in suspense. I am, if necessary, prepared to die." Then the jeweller repeated all that he had learnt from the confidant. "You see," continued he, "your destruction is inevitable. Rise, save yourself by flight, for the time is precious. You of all men must not expose yourself to the anger of the Caliph, and less than any confess in the midst of torture." At these words the prince was ready to expire through grief, affliction, and fear. However, he recovered himself and asked the jeweller what resolution he would advise him to take in this conjuncture, every moment of which ought to be employed. The jeweller told him he thought nothing remained but that he should immediately take horse and hasten away towards Anbar, that he might get thither before day. "Take what servants and swift horses you think necessary," continued he, "and suffer me to escape with you." The prince, seeing nothing more to be done, immediately gave orders to prepare such an equipage as would be least troublesome, took money and jewels, and having taken leave of his mother, departed with the jeweller and such servants as he had chosen. They travelled all night without stopping, till at length, both their horses and themselves being spent with so long a journey, they halted to rest themselves. They had hardly alighted before they found themselves surrounded and assaulted by a band of robbers. They defended their lives for some time courageously, but at length the prince's servants being all killed, both he and the jeweller were obliged to yield at discretion. The robbers, however, spared their lives, but after they had seized the horses and baggage, they took away their clothes and left them naked. When the thieves were gone, the prince said to the jeweller, "What think you of our adventure and condition? Had I not better have tarried in Baghdad and awaited my death?" "Prince," replied the jeweller, "it is the decree of heaven that we should thus suffer. It has pleased God to add affliction to affliction, and we must not murmur, but receive his chastisements with submission. Let us stay no longer here, but seek for some retreat, where we may perhaps be relieved." "Let me die," said the prince, "for what signifies it whether I die here or elsewhere? Perhaps while we are talking, Shams-ul-Nihar is no more, and why should I endeavour to live after she is dead?" The jeweller, by his entreaty, at length prevailed on him, and they had not gone far before they came to a mosque which was open. They entered it, and passed there the remainder of the night. At daybreak a man came into the mosque. When he had ended his prayer, as he turned about to go away, he perceived the prince and jeweller, who were sitting in a corner. He came up to them, and after having saluted them with a great deal of civility, said, "I perceive you are strangers." The jeweller answered, "You are not deceived. We have been robbed tonight in coming from Baghdad, as you may see, and have retired hither for shelter, but we know not to whom to apply." "If you think fit to accompany me to my house," answered the man, "I will give you all the assistance in my power." Upon this obliging offer, the jeweller turned to the prince and whispered, "This man, as you perceive, sir, does not know us, and we have reason to fear that somebody else may come who does. We cannot, I think, refuse his offer." "Do as you please," said the prince. "I am willing to be guided by your discretion." The man, observing the prince and jeweller consulting together, and thinking they made some difficulty to accept his offer, asked them if they were resolved what to do. The jeweller answered, "We are ready to follow you. All we hesitate about is that we are ashamed to appear thus naked." Fortunately, the man had it in his power to cover them sufficiently till they could get to his house. As soon as they had entered, he brought a very handsome suit for each of them. As he thought they must be hungry and might wish to be alone, he had several dishes brought to them by a slave, but they ate little, especially the prince, who was so dejected and dispirited that he gave the jeweller cause to fear he would die. Their host visited them several times in the course of the day, and in the evening, as he knew they wanted to rest, he left them early. But he was no sooner in bed than the jeweller was forced to call him again to assist at the death of the Prince of Persia. He found him breathe short and with difficulty, which gave him reason to fear he had but few minutes to live. Coming near him, the prince said, "It is all over, and I am glad you are witness of my last words. I quit life with a great deal of satisfaction. I need not tell you the reason, for you know it already. All my concern is that I cannot die in the arms of my dear mother, who has always loved me tenderly, and for whom I had a reciprocal affection. Let her know how much I was concerned at this, and request her in my name to have my body removed to Baghdad, that she may have an opportunity to bedew my tomb with her tears and assist my departed soul with her prayers." He then took notice of the master of the house, and thanked him for his kindness in taking him in, and after desiring him to let his body rest with him till it should be conveyed to Baghdad, he expired. The day after the prince's death, the jeweller took the opportunity of a numerous caravan that was going to Baghdad, and arrived there in safety. He first went home to change his clothes, and then hastened to the prince's palace, where everybody was alarmed at not seeing the prince with him. He desired them to acquaint the prince's mother that he wished to speak with her, and it was not long before he was introduced to her in a hall, with several of her women about her. "Madam," said he to her, with an air that sufficiently denoted the ill news he brought, "God preserve you, and shower down upon you the choicest of his blessings. You cannot be ignorant that he alone disposes of us at his pleasure." The princess would not permit him to proceed, but exclaimed, "Alas! You bring me the news of my son's death?" She and her women at the same time wept and sobbed loudly. At length she checked her sighs and groans, and begged of him to continue without concealing from her the least circumstance of such a melancholy separation. He satisfied her, and when he had done, she farther demanded of him if her son the prince had not given him in charge something more particular in his last moments. He assured her his last words were, that it was to him the most afflicting circumstance that he must die so far distant from his dear mother, and that the only thing he wished was, that she would have his corpse transported to Baghdad. Accordingly, early next morning the princess set out with her women and great part of her slaves, to bring her son's body to her own palace. When the jeweller, whom she had detained, had seen her depart, he returned home very sad and melancholy, at the reflection that so accomplished and amiable a prince was thus cut off in the flower of his age. As he walked towards his house, dejected and musing, he saw a woman standing before him. He recognized her to be Shams-el-Nihar's confidante. At the sight of her, his tears began to flow afresh, but he said nothing to her, and going into his own house, she followed him. They sat down, when the jeweller, beginning the conversation, asked the confidante with a deep sigh if she had heard of the death of the Prince of Persia, and if it was on his account that she grieved. "Alas!" answered she, "what, is that charming prince then dead? He has not lived long after his dear Shams-el-Nihar. Beauteous souls," continued she, "in whatsoever place ye are now, ye must be happy that your loves will no more be interrupted. Your bodies were an obstacle to your wishes, but heaven has delivered you from them. You may now form the closest union." The jeweller, who had heard nothing of Shams-el-Nihar's death, and had not reflected that the confidante was in mourning, suffered fresh grief at this intelligence. "Is Shams-el-Nihar then dead?" cried he. "She is," replied the confidante, weeping afresh, "and it is for her I wear these weeds. The circumstances of her death were extraordinary," continued she, "and deserve to be known to you. But before I give you an account of them, I beg you to acquaint me with those of the Prince of Persia, whom, with my dearest friend and mistress, I shall lament as long as I live." The jeweller then gave the confidante the information she desired, and after he had told her all, even to the departure of the prince's mother to bring her son's body to Baghdad, she began and said, "You have not forgotten that I told you the Caliph had sent for Shams-el-Nihar to his palace. He had, as we had every reason to believe, been informed of the amour betwixt her and the prince by the two slaves, whom he had examined apart. You may imagine he would be exceedingly enraged at Shemso-Nihar's conduct, and giving striking proofs of his jealousy and of his impending vengeance against the prince. But this was by no means the case. He pitied Shemso-Nihar, and in some measure blamed himself for what had happened in giving her so much freedom to walk about the city without being attended by his eunuchs. This is the only conclusion that could be drawn from his extraordinary behavior towards her, as you will hear. He received her with an open countenance, and when he observed that the melancholy which oppressed her did not lessen her beauty, for she appeared thus before him without surprise or fear, with a goodness worthy himself, he said, "Shemso-Nihar, I cannot bear you appearing before me thus with an air which gives me infinite pain. You must needs be sensible how much I have always loved you, and be convinced of the sincerity of my passion by the continued demonstrations I have given of it. I can never change my mind, for I love you more than ever. You have enemies, Shemso-Nihar," proceeded he, "and those enemies have insinuated things against your conduct, but all they have said against you has not made the least impression upon me. Shake off, then, this melancholy, and prepare to entertain me this night with some amusing conversation after your accustomed manner." He said many other obliging things to her, and then desired her to step into a magnificent apartment near her own, and wait for him. The afflicted Shemso-Nihar was very sensible of the Caliph's kindness, but the more she thought herself obliged to him, the more she was concerned that she was so far removed, perhaps for ever, from her prince, without whom she could not live. "This interview between the Caliph and Shemso-Nihar," continued the confidant, "took place whilst I was come to speak to you, and I learned the particulars of it from my companions who were present. But I had no sooner left you," proceeded she, "than I went to my dear mistress again, and was eyewitness to what happened in the evening. I found her in the apartment I told you of, and as she thought I came from you, she drew near me, and whispering me, said, 'I am much obliged to you for the service you have done me, but I feel it will be the last.' She said no more, but I was not in a place proper to offer anything to comfort her. The Caliph was introduced at night with the sound of instruments which her women played upon, and the collation was immediately served up. He took his mistress by the hand, and made her sit down with him on the sofa. She put such a force upon herself to please him, that she expired a few minutes after. In short, she was hardly set down when she fell backwards. The Caliph believed she had only fainted, and so we all thought, but she never recovered, and in this manner we lost her. The Caliph did her the honour to weep over her, not being able to refrain from tears, and before he left the room ordered all the musical instruments to be broken. This was immediately done. I stayed with her corpse all night, and next morning washed and dressed her for her funeral, bathing her with my tears. The Caliph had her interred in a magnificent tomb he had erected for her in her lifetime, in a place she had desired to be buried in. "Now, since you tell me," said she, "the Prince of Persia's body is to be brought to Baghdad, I will use my best endeavours that he shall be interred in the same tomb." The jeweller was much surprised at this resolution of the confidant, and said, "Certainly you do not consider that the Caliph will never suffer this?" "You think the thing impossible," replied she. "It is not. You will alter your opinion when I tell you that the Caliph has given liberty to all her slaves, with a pension to each for their support. He has committed to me the care and keeping of my mistress's tomb, and allotted me an annual income for that purpose, and for my maintenance. Besides, the Caliph, who was not ignorant of the amour between Shemso-Nihar and the prince, as I've already told you, without being offended, will not be sorry if after her death he be buried with her." To all this the jeweller had not a word to say. He earnestly entreated the confidant to conduct him to her mistress's tomb, that he might say his prayers over her. When he came in sight of it, he was not a little surprised to find a vast concourse of people of both sexes, who were come thither from all parts of Baghdad. As he could not come near the tomb, he said his prayers at a distance, and then going to the confidant who was waiting hard by, said to her, "I am now so far from thinking that what you proposed cannot be put in execution, that you and I need only publish abroad what we know of the amour of this unfortunate couple, and how the prince died much about the same time with his mistress. Before his corpse arrives, all Baghdad will concur to desire that two such faithful lovers, whom nothing could divide in affection whilst they lived, should not be separated when dead." It happened as he said, for as soon as it was known that the corpse was within a day's journey of the city, an infinite number of people went about 20 miles to meet it, and afterwards walked before it till it came to the city gate, where the confidant, waiting for that purpose, presented herself before the prince's mother, and begged of her, in the name of the whole city, who earnestly desired it, that she would be pleased to consent that the bodies of the two lovers, who had but one heart whilst they lived, from the time their mutual passion commenced, might be buried in the same tomb. The princess immediately consented, and the corpse of the prince, instead of being deposited in his own burying place, was laid by Shams-ul-Nihar's side, after it had been carried along in procession at the head of an infinite number of people of all ranks. From that time all the inhabitants of Baghdad, and even strangers from all parts of the world, where the Mohammedan religion prevails, have held that tomb in the highest veneration, and pay their devotions at it. End of section 19.